Hello and welcome to this edition of Constitutionally Sound, a podcast brought to you by the Centre on Constitutional Change at the University of Edinburgh. I'm Nicola McEwen, a Professor of Territorial Politics and Fellow of the Centre, and for the next half hour or so we'll be discussing migration and its effects on the labour market. We've heard lots about staff shortages causing delays or cancellations in airline travel, train disruptions, the problems in the hospitality and social care sectors. Many of you listening might have felt the effects of these. We'll be discussing whether and how migration policy alongside the consequences of Brexit and Covid are at the root of these challenges in the labour market. And what does it mean for the devolved institutions who don't have lawmaking powers over immigration policy but might feel the effects of it nonetheless? Should immigration be devolved? What scope is there for having divergent immigration policies for countries sharing the same islands at this corner of Europe? To discuss these issues, I am delighted to be joined by two experts in the field. Dr Sarah Kyambi is an expert on UK immigration policy and director of the think tank Migration Policy Scotland. She founded Migration Policy Scotland in 2020, having become increasingly aware of the need for greater policy capacity on migration policy in Scotland. Professor David Bell is Emeritus Professor of Economics at the University of Stirling, where he was Professor for over 30 years. He's also a Research Fellow at the Centre on Constitutional Change and also at the Centre for Population Change. David's research centres on labour economics, public finances and the economics of long-term care, and he has a particular interest in the effects of demographic change on the Scottish economy. And among his many advisory positions, he's served as a member of the Independent Expert Advisory Group on Migration and Population, set up by the Scottish Government a few years ago. David, Sarah, welcome to the podcast. David, if you wouldn't mind just painting a picture for us, we do seem to be seeing staff shortages in transport, hospitality and so on, cancellations and disruptions. At the same time, strikes as workers demand wage growth. What is the state of the labour market and how unusual or typical does it appear to you?
The labour market is in a very unusual state, certainly not one that I've seen in the 30 or so years that you referred to, where I've been looking at the labour market. And what is very unusual is that the number of recorded vacancies in the economy is actually greater than the number of people who are registered unemployed. So we would describe that as a situation where there's excess demand for labour. And indeed, that labours across a range of sectors. Many of them would be described, although not always accurately, as low-skilled sectors. And we'll maybe pick up later on that new immigration policy is aimed at encouraging highly skilled workers to come to the UK. However, the effect of the lack of unskilled workers is partly to do with Brexit, the cut-off of European workers no longer being able to come easily to the UK. It's also to do with COVID. COVID had significant effects on the labour market, whereby people who went on furlough were sort of held in abeyance for sometimes several months. And not all of them wanted to go back to the jobs that they had previously been engaged with before. So that disrupted the labour market. Then there were COVID-induced problems with supply chains from the Far East and within the country, just getting goods from A to B. And these difficulties led to shortages, which in turn led to price increases. So although there's been upward pressure on wages, there's also been upward pressure on prices. And the price pressure has also been exacerbated by the energy crisis, which in turn, in part, stems from the war in Ukraine, which has seen gas and oil prices go shooting up. And this has led to the situation where, although there's excess demand for workers, prices are actually rising faster than wages. And so workers' real incomes are actually largely falling. And in consequence of this, workers have become extremely unhappy. And we're seeing that evidenced by the kind of industrial action that we haven't seen for several decades.
So you point to a multitude of factors and pressures there, David, and a lot of those are beyond the control of government, but some are a policy choice. And I noticed recently that the bosses of big airlines were blaming Brexit as a key factor in their industry, at least for the staff shortages. Sarah, I'm wondering if you kind of share David's diagnosis there as the explanations for the patterns that we're seeing, and how much would you attribute to the changes in migration policy directly resulting from Brexit?
Well, I mean, I'd certainly defer to David in terms of the overall analysis. I think there is a very complicated picture playing out with lots of different drivers, of which migration is only one. But within that, I would say that the ending of free movement that has come as a result of Brexit, so that's the migration of EU nationals being able to migrate to the UK for work mainly. The ending of that is historic. It's a very significant change to the migration system that we have operated in this country for several decades. And it's particularly impactful in Scotland and other areas that are not traditional migration areas, because those areas have seen most of their migration. Scotland is one of very few regions of the UK where EU migrants make up as large a proportion of the overall migrant population as non-EU migrants. In most parts of England, particularly, that is non-EU migrants are the majority. So in a way, the ending of free movement will have more of an impact in Scotland, but it is also a very historic moment in terms of labour migration and the switching of that migration that we had predominantly used, particularly for migration into lower paid work. And so that's where we're seeing most of the impact, as we are switching into using the UK's overall immigration system for all of its labour migration needs. And while that system has eased up and we're generally seeing the same number of migrants, I think the impact on Scotland probably are rather less favourable, because we have lost free movement as part of that. And the difficulty with the UK immigration system as it stands at the moment is that it's a much more cumbersome system to operate. And I think that will have an impact on particularly on smaller businesses.
Can you explain that a little bit more, Sarah, as to why, I think you said the overall number of migrants has broadly remained the same, but they're coming from different places? Is that the case? And why is it that Scotland isn't able to attract migrants from beyond the EU in the way that it was from within the EU?
I'm not sure as to what the reason for that would be. I think what we had seen in Scotland was that the increase in migration to Scotland over the last 20 years was coming to a significant extent from free movement migration. And while for the rest of the UK, post-Brexit, what we have seen is essentially quite a shift to migration coming from areas outside the EU. I wonder whether, once one drills down into that data, and it's currently rather difficult to do, whether for Scotland that's actually more of a challenge than it is for other parts of the UK. And some of that might just be about migration networks, about how industries have gotten used to using free movement, and that now they would need to get used to using other ways of attracting migrant workers into their sectors and into the jobs that they have to offer.
David, you talked about UK policy, migration policy post-Brexit being about a points-based system designed to create high-wage, high-skill economy. Is it succeeding? And what challenges does that pose for sectors that are dependent, as you said, on less skilled and less valued in salary terms, at least, but nonetheless crucial employment?
Sarah is exactly right. The change in policy to a points-based system has, in one way, been met one of the Brexit challenges, so that the policy has been much more global and less continental with the ending of free movement. And as Sarah said, the level of migration migration into the UK hasn't changed that much. but the composition has changed dramatically. So the first three countries in the year to March 2022 were, in terms of those who were given the skilled visa or whose skilled visa applications were successful to the UK, were India, Nigeria, and the Philippines. So India had more than 80,000 successful applications. France had about 4,000. So that's just an idea of the turnaround that there's been in the composition of migration to the UK. Now, we don't, as Sarah indicated, yet really know how that's been distributed, how these migrants have been distributed across the UK. These figures hopefully will come soon, but my suspicion is that there will be a huge concentration of these migrants in the southeast of England, so that another objective of the UK government, namely the levelling up agenda, will actually be undermined by this new migration policy. I agree with Sarah that the increase in population that Scotland experienced during the last 2 decades was primarily spiked by a big inflow of migrants from Eastern Europe in the first few years of this century. That partly because there isn't the stock of migrants from the new countries that are predominating in terms of migrant flows within Scotland, is one of the reasons why I suspect that we won't be getting such a fillip to the population as we did in the early part of the century. And the emphasis on skilled migrants is partly what's causing the shortages in these so-called, as you say, unskilled, but not necessarily so, occupations, hospitality, care, agriculture, and so on.
That's a good point at which to turn to thinking about this in a devolution context. Immigration, as you know, is a reserved matter. It's a matter for the lawmaking powers of the UK Parliament. Given what you were saying about the pressures and the geographical element to immigration, should there be a territorial or a geography component brought into UK immigration policy, perhaps, as you say, as part of the levelling up agenda? And how effectively could that happen, Sarah?
There's a number of ways in which you could have a more regionalised policy on immigration, and indeed we've seen that in the past with the Fresh Talent Initiative for Scotland in 2004, where you create variations in the rules. And I really think there's a real spectrum, from kind of the devolution of powers relating to migration, entry, exit, but there's also options to provide more kind of roles or mechanisms or build in more regional sensitivity into the immigration system in such a way as would allow Scotland to pursue some of its own aims from immigration in a way that currently aren't really being acknowledged within the UK system as a whole, which to some degree the UK system is currently the rationale for a more restrictive system is very much the Brexit vote and the 2019 election, rather than meeting shortages in certain sectors or pursuing population goals. So I think there are countries where those different goals of different regions are acknowledged within the immigration system and are built in. So Canada does this with provincial nominee visas. Australia has an element of that, again, in relation to population demands, but it's also smaller places like Switzerland, Spain, for example, have regional elements as part of their immigration system in recognition that there's a whole range of things, of policy aims you might be seeking to achieve with immigration, and there are ways of trying to achieve this. But in the UK so far, that conversation does not appear to have be explored in a practical way on how it could be done, which would involve kind of really looking through how one would enforce such a system. You could use aspects of the hostile environment actually make enforcing or making such a system operational actually interesting, would make that easier, because you would need to find not necessarily borders between different regions, but actually it's much more about having controls that people who, say, get a work visa to work in a certain area abide by the conditions that their visa comes with.
David, am I right in thinking that the expert advisory group that you served on migration and population did make some recommendations in this direction? And what do you think explains the reluctance in the UK to adopt a more regionalised approach to immigration?
Yes, we did make such a recommendation. Fell on deaf ears, I think. The issue partly is around what Sarah's just been talking about. How do you actually operationalise a scheme where you ask workers to stay in a particular area for a given period of time? The view, I think, that the UK government took was that everyone would go to London, which doesn't terribly help, and in fact, in some cases is manifestly untrue. But nevertheless, that was largely the view that they took. In a way, there is an argument, for example, for agricultural workers, that what is needed is something that allows for some flexibility. So some seasonal workers in particular spend some time in England before moving up to Scotland as the crops ripen at different points in time. There's a case for thinking more extensively about how you set a regionally specific migration policy, but one could start at least with running pilots to see if how such a system might work. But the UK government is just simply not interested.
There are, of course, ongoing debates and discussions around different constitutional settlements, including options for further devolution. A number of political parties in Scotland looking at this, Constitutional Commission in Wales looking at this. What would be the options for devolving immigration policy rather than relying on the UK government to adopt a regionalised approach? Can you devolve and have a scheme that was suited more to the needs of the devolved nations of the UK? Sarah, are there comparative examples that we can draw on there to help?
The difficulty with it is if it's part of a devolved context. I think as David was mentioning with the pilots, this is not so much a question as to where the powers lie, but in terms of getting the different levels of government working together but allowing each other to pursue different aims. So I can see options where, the powers would go to Scotland, but without the requisite working relationship with the Home Office, that would not lead to the best results, because actually you need to trial things. You need to trial how a scheme would work alongside enforcement powers. I think there's a lot to be explored there, but I think the conversation does need to go beyond where the powers lie and move much more towards what are the different practical ends that different parts of the UK can legitimately pursue from migration. How can that actually be made operationally effective? And I think it's particularly for rural areas or where one might look at pilots to see how well some of that would work. And I do think some of that would require actually both, the pilots to let you explore and test the actual impacts of different types of schemes and see what might be effective and what would not be effective. I think there's the prospect of having certain routes that you set up that simply are, don't work as intended within the system as a whole otherwise.
Yeah, I would agree with Sarah on that point. I mean, without greater levels of intergovernmental coordination, it's difficult to see how a devolved policy would work. And indeed, one might think of devolving policy within Scotland, for example, or within one of the other regions, because the challenges that different parts of Scotland face are also quite different.
It's interesting, though, in that you said before your recommendation had fallen on deaf ears. Might it be the case that devolving power and responsibility to devise immigration policy for Scotland or for Wales would enhance the ability of those governments to ensure that their views are not falling on deaf ears? Would it not potentially help the intergovernmental coordination that you both put forward, and I agree is absolutely essential here?
I find more of the frustration is looking at that as a constitutional issue rather than as a migration policy problem to be resolved. I don't know what the effect would be in terms of improving intergovernmental cooperation, and it may well be, as you say, but I can also see ways in which you would open routes that have very little discernible effect, or because they're not well joined up. I think that there's a need to try to kind of pull in the same direction insofar as allowing or legitimating the different ends being pursued and trying to actually make that happen. It feels a little bit that at the moment that is the conversation that eludes us.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's partly about that recognition that Scotland's demographic pressures are different from those in England, say, and until there is some agreement from governments that therefore the goals of policy might reasonably differ across the UK. Until that happens, it's unlikely that this conversation will move forward.
If it doesn't happen, David, what would you estimate or model as an economist? What would you see as the longer term demographic pressures for the Scottish economy if there isn't a change to migration policy that leads to greater migrants for Scotland, and indeed for Wales, where I'm sure that the pressures will be similar?
I'm old enough to remember when the population projections for Scotland were that, and this was in the late 90s, that the population would start dipping due to the considerable slowdown in the birth rate. That changed once the EU accession migration happened in the early 2000s. And remember that migrants are typically young and often have families, and therefore they change the sort of age profile of the population. It's now the case that National Records for Scotland's latest projections are seeing the Scottish population rising to 5.5 million, but in I think it's the middle of the next decade, but then falling. And the main driver of the population change because births and deaths are about in balance, the main driver is what they expect, namely a fall in net migration to Scotland. And what that means is that there will be an older population on average. It's more difficult to increase productivity rapidly with an aging population. And given also that migrants typically, though not universally, are more skilled than the native population, slow down in economic growth. And the consequence of that is lower taxation revenue for Scotland and slower growth in public services. So it has important implications, the changes that we are seeing taking place.
Would the demographic pressures that you've just been talking about become more acute in the context of independence? Does immigration and increasing immigration become more important?
Arguably, if Scotland is not part of the UK, then it will feel the impact of its rather fast ageing population more keenly, because there's less ability to offset that against the younger population in the rest of the UK. So in that sense, I think it becomes more important. But the thing is, it's already important. And I suppose the benefit would be that then as an independent sovereign state, Scotland would have the levers to set its own population, migration policy within which it could factor in pursuing its population aims. So it would have significantly more freedom to address that question within its migration framework. Having said that, there will always then still be the issue, will it be able to effectively implement that? Will it be able to both attract and retain migrants? And will those be the right migrants in the right places? So there's a lot of open questions there as well.
I'm just wondering, because the problems that you identified with devolving immigration policy would presumably still be there in the context of independence over immigration policy, would they not?
Yes, absolutely. There are a number of complications. So one is that Scotland would almost certainly be part of the Common Travel Area, which at the moment is the Republic of Ireland and the UK. So that would mean travel would be unencumbered between Scotland, England, and Ireland, for that matter. And then the question is, do you feel strongly enough about your migration policy to ensure that you police who is settling where closely? And I think as an English-speaking country, Scotland would in many respects be quite an attractive destination if provided a good standard of living and a good set of public services. And then almost inevitably, as in other small European countries of around the same size, there might be pressures to rein in immigration, to adopt controls in the way, for example, that Denmark appears to be examining at the moment.
You mentioned the common travel area, David, across these islands, and that it is a central component of the vision for independence. But does that constrain what any government can do in terms of developing a very different type of immigration policy? And would it necessitate having still some of that coordination that Sarah talked about, or even similarity in policy goals, or can you still diverge even within the common travel area?
My view, Sarah may differ, is that the more that you are willing to diverge, and there's no reason why you shouldn't diverge, the more likely it is that you'll have to devote considerable resources to ensuring that your policy is successful. So having to keep more of a check around where people are and what they're doing. But there's no reason why you shouldn't diverge. Ireland has had a much more liberal policy, for example, in welcoming Ukrainian refugees than UK has, even though we're in a common travel area.
I see a lot of questions that I feel we have no answers to as yet. I think the situation now compared to 2014 makes the membership of the CTA and the European Union at the same time, and what those things, it's much more complicated, and I think there's a lot to be worked out in terms of how much divergence that system going forwards could take, or how that might be worked through. But I would certainly agree with David that the more you would diverge, the more you would also then have to enforce these different systems against each other. Therefore, some measure of not necessarily borders, but controls, not necessarily controls at borders, but border controls where you try to make sure that people are not using entry into one territory in order to go and work or study or even live in another in ways that you're not intending. So I think it's a very complicated picture to which we don't yet have that many answers, and it's not quite clear where the most persuasive impetus still come from the UK, from as the largest common travel area country, or would the leading impulse come from the EU, with both an independent Scotland and the Republic of Ireland as EU members needing to enforce what would then be external EU borders?
That's really fascinating, Sarah. Can I just get you to clarify a little bit, because you said not necessarily controls at the border, but border controls. What might those border controls look like if they weren't controls at the border?
You're kind of asking me about something that I would love to do more work on, because I feel that we do not know enough about what the options there would be. But I think what I would caution against is the idea that border controls is always that there is a sort of a physical marker somewhere where somebody checks your documents. And I think in a way borders are much more diffuse now, and it's about, employers checking your right to work, So you would make sure that you would have the right to work in the territory that you're working in, and that would happen in a workplace, or that a service provider would check your eligibility for a particular service, which might include your immigration status. So these might be happening in different locations, but and could potentially benefit from increased automation. But I'm always hesitant to kind of kick the solution for these types of issues into, automation could help us solve that. I think it might, but there's a lot that's open there. But I think when we talk about that this will require borders, what I would like to get away from is the idea that it would be kind of borders and checkpoints, in the way I think often that's what appears in people's imaginations when they think about crossing an international border.
There may be ways of dealing with enforcement that don't involve physical checks at borders, and more information on people's activities and location is becoming available. You then run into a set of ethical questions about how far you want to track people and whether that's consistent with a liberal democracy. But these are some way down the line, but are the kinds of problems you might well run into.
One final question. Whether under independence or under devolution or indeed under a regionalised system, if there was to be a distinctive immigration policy for Scotland, how would we be able to ensure that it didn't just recreate the same problems with a drift towards London that we see in the UK as a drift towards the central belt in Scotland, when some of the pressures are being felt most acutely in rural Scotland?
Part of this is around the whole levelling up debate and the importance of supporting economic development not necessarily all outside the central belt, because there are parts of the central belt that have significant economic problems. But because you can't have economic development thriving everywhere, I guess some difficult choices have to be made, but there can be support for economic development in a limited number of places outside our main cities. And then the issue is how that support happens, but only if these new, let me call them hubs, succeed, will you get migrants willing to stick with them. So, because otherwise there won't be jobs available and the inevitable drift occurs. So economic development and immigration have to go hand in hand.
Yes, I'd absolutely second that. I think the factors that make people leave rural areas for cities would make migrants leave as well. So I think migration is a strand in what needs to be a much more comprehensive strategy, within which you then, and this is the migration policy and the route related point, is that you then do have to select the migrants for these programs really carefully, so that they're well enough matched that you have got a chance at retention. And we do know that can be made to work. There are provincial nominee programs in Canada, for instance, that select very carefully people with characteristics to match local job markets and show links to areas that have got population related challenges and are seeing very high retention rates above 90%. So it can be done, but it is a very difficult job, and it's a job that needs to be done by addressing the full range of factors that's driving that situation, of which migration is just one.
Sarah, David, thank you very much for joining us today. That's been a fascinating discussion of the complexities and the challenges in migration and its clearly profound effects on the labour market. And thanks to all of you for tuning in to today's episode. You've been listening to Constitutionally Sound from the Centre on Constitutional Change with me, Nicola McEwen, Professor David Bell of Stirling University, and Dr Sarah Kyambi, Director of the think tank Migration Policy Scotland. And if you want to learn more about these issues and engage in discussions, I'd recommend following up the think tank's website on migrationpolicyscotland.org.uk. Speak to you next time. Thank you.